The Meridian Trade Station existed in a state of perpetual, organized chaos that would have impressed even the most dedicated students of entropy. Suspended in the gravitational sweet spot between three different star systems, it served as the galaxy's premier commercial hub, a massive ring of metal and crystallized energy, where over 300 species came to conduct what they generously termed civilized commerce. The station's designers, in a fit of optimistic engineering, had created separate environmental zones for beings who required everything from liquid methane atmospheres to pure electromagnetic fields. What they hadn't anticipated was the sheer bureaucratic nightmare of managing trade relationships between species whose fundamental concepts of reality were so divergent that some of them literally couldn't perceive each other's existence without specialized equipment. Consider, for instance, the ongoing dispute in Bay 47, where the Jelkari collective crystalline beings, who communicated exclusively through complex mathematical equations, were attempting to negotiate shipping rates with the Nethmore Confederation, a species of sentient gas clouds who existed in multiple probability states simultaneously. The Zelkari kept presenting precise numerical calculations, while the Nethmore responded with probability clouds that suggested their answer was simultaneously yes, no, and a complex derivative of purple. This was considered a routine Tuesday morning negotiation. Into this carnival of cosmic commerce had recently arrived humanity's latest contribution to galactic civilization, Earth Corporation's Interstellar Trade Division. The news had spread through the station like a particularly virulent form of economic anxiety. Humans, it seemed, had decided to expand their business operations beyond their single Deathworld, and they were approaching interstellar commerce with the same casual disregard for established protocols that had already terrorized three different galactic governments. The problem wasn't that humans were violent, though their reputation as Category-9 Deathworlders did tend to make other species nervous. The problem was that they were practical. While other species had spent millennia developing elaborate trade rituals, complex negotiation ceremonies, and bureaucratic procedures so intricate they bordered on religious observance, humans had apparently looked at the entire system and asked the most terrifying question in the galactic lexicon: why? Captain Vera Blackwood stepped off the EarthCorp transport vessel with a kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had places to be and problems to solve, preferably before lunch. She was a tall woman, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, the kind of face that suggested extensive experience with both engineering problems and the idiots who created them, and the unsettling habit of making direct eye contact when she spoke. Her arrival triggered approximately 63 different species emergency protocols simultaneously. The fact that she was carrying actual paper documents, primitive physical media that suggested either extreme poverty or dangerous unpredictability, caused the Veltai delegation to immediately seal their environmental suits. The steaming cup of coffee in her other hand was even more alarming, since most of the galaxy considered caffeine to be either a controlled substance or a chemical weapon, depending on local regulations. But it was her smile that really set everyone on edge. Humans, according to the xenobiological reports, displayed their internal calcium framework as a social gesture. The implications had kept trade analysts awake for weeks. What kind of message was being conveyed when humans grinned during business negotiations? Was it a threat display? A warning that they were about to consume something? A sign that they were preparing to do something catastrophically creative? "Morning, everyone," Vera announced cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the fact that half the station's population had just activated their emergency evacuation protocols. "I'm Captain Blackwood, from Earth Corp. I'm here for the 0900 Trade Conference, and I brought donuts." The mention of donuts, whatever those were, caused three different species to immediately begin updating their insurance policies. The Meridian Station's conference chamber Omega-7 had been designed to accommodate the diverse needs of galactic commerce. The room featured adjustable gravity fields, customizable atmospheric zones, and translation matrices capable of converting everything from subsonic rumbles to quantum fluctuations into comprehensible communication. What it hadn't been designed for was the kind of meeting that was about to take place. The conference table, a marvel of engineering that existed in 17 different dimensional phases simultaneously, was surrounded by representatives from some of the galaxy's most influential trading corporations. The Xel'Kari had sent a delegation of their finest mathematical philosophers, beings whose crystalline forms refracted light in patterns that conveyed complex economic theories. The Nethmore Confederation existed as a shimmering cloud of probability near the far end of the table, their presence detectable only through the gentle humming of uncertainty that surrounded them. The Veltai Trade Syndicate had arrived with their usual complement of bureaucratic specialists, each one equipped with enough documentation to establish a small government. Their leader, a methane-breathing creature whose environmental suit was covered in official seals and regulatory badges, had spent the morning reviewing the 847 different forms required to conduct business with a new species. But it was the Hegemony Trade Consortium that dominated the room, both literally and figuratively. Their representative, Director Kral'thox, was exactly what central casting would order if they needed someone to play intimidating alien business executive in a corporate thriller. Standing 4 meters tall on 6 powerful legs, with 6 arms that ended in razor-sharp claws and a head that looked like it had been designed by a committee of predators, he represented everything that most galactic species found properly impressive in a business partner. The Drakari, Kral'thox's species, had built their commercial empire on a simple principle. Bigger was better, stronger was superior, and everyone else should be grateful for the opportunity to acknowledge their obvious genetic advantages. It had worked remarkably well for them over the centuries, establishing their consortium as one of the major economic powers through a combination of superior technology, aggressive expansion, and the kind of negotiation tactics that made other species grateful when contracts didn't end with their homeworlds being foreclosed upon. So, Vera said, settling into her chair with the casual confidence of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of coffee and common sense, "I've been reading through your standard trade agreements, and I have to say, they're fascinating examples of how to make simple transactions incredibly complicated." The silence that followed was profound enough to achieve its own gravitational field. Around the table, various species began making the subtle preparations that experienced traders recognized as the prelude to either immediate evacuation or extensive legal documentation. "Fascinating," Director Kral'thox repeated, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made most beings instinctively check their insurance coverage. Perhaps the human representative would care to elaborate on this assessment. "Well," Vera said, pulling out a tablet that was apparently running on some kind of primitive electronic technology. "Let's start with your basic commodity exchange protocols. You've got a 17-step verification process for standard metal alloys, which includes 3 different blessing ceremonies, 2 mathematical proofs, and what appears to be a ritual sacrifice of administrative efficiency." She scrolled through her notes with the casual efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. "Then there's the cultural compatibility assessment, which requires both parties to demonstrate that their species' fundamental understanding of reality aligns sufficiently to permit commercial exchange. That one's my personal favorite, especially the part where you have to prove that your concept of ownership is compatible with 17 different philosophical frameworks." The Xel'Kari delegation began emitting light patterns that roughly translated to, "This is either brilliant or catastrophic, possibly both." The Nethmore Confederation shifted into a probability state that suggested they were simultaneously impressed, terrified, and considering legal action. "And then," Vera continued, apparently warming to her subject, "there's the dispute resolution mechanism, which appears to involve a complex arbitration process that takes an average of 47 years to complete, assuming none of the parties involved evolve into a different species during the proceedings." Director Kral'thox's 6 arms began to twitch in the way that Drakari behavioral specialists recognized as a prelude into either flight or extreme economic aggression. Given that Kral'thox had built his reputation on never retreating from a negotiation, the alternatives were limited and concerning. "The human," he said, each word emerging like a small financial crisis, appears to be criticizing established trade protocols that have maintained galactic commercial stability for over 4,000 years. Not criticizing, Vera corrected cheerfully. Streamlining. See, where I come from, we have a saying. Time is money. And when it takes longer to negotiate a contract than it does for improved time, some species to achieve sentience, you're probably overthinking the process. She leaned forward slightly, and her smile took on the quality that had made 3 different galactic governments revise their first contact protocols. So I've taken the liberty of preparing some alternative proposals that might help everyone save time, money, and paperwork. The tablet she placed on the table was apparently displaying what humans optimistically called a simplified trade agreement. The document was 3 pages long, written in clear, concise language, and contained exactly 0 references to philosophical frameworks, cultural compatibility assessments, or ritual blessings. The reaction was immediate and diverse. The Veltai representative began hyperventilating into his environmental suit. The Jelkari delegation's light patterns shifted to configurations that roughly translated to "this is either genius or the end of civilization as we know it." The Nethmore Confederation collapsed into quantum state of pure uncertainty. Director Kral'thox looked at the document with the expression of someone who had just been handed a live grenade disguised as a birthday present. "This," he said carefully, "appears to be missing several essential components. Where are the cultural alignment protocols? The philosophical compatibility matrices? The ceremonial acknowledgments of cosmic hierarchy? Those aren't essential," Vera replied. "They're just complicated ways of doing simple things. You want to buy our stuff, we want to sell it to you. We agree on a price and delivery schedule. Everyone signs the contract, done. Everything else is just paperwork for the sake of paperwork." The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the quiet sound of several species' worldviews undergoing emergency restructuring. In the gallery above, a small crowd of observers had gathered, representatives from other corporations who had come to watch what was either going to be the most efficient trade negotiation in galactic history or a spectacular demonstration of why humans were classified as Deathworlders. "Perhaps," Director Kral'thox said, his voice dropping to a register that made the furniture vibrate, "the human representative fails to understand the importance of tradition, hierarchy, and respect for established order." "Oh, I understand hierarchy," Vera said, taking a sip of her coffee and apparently missing the fact that she had just been issued what amounted to a formal challenge by a 4-meter predator with 6 arms full of claws. "We've got plenty of hierarchies back on Earth. Military hierarchies, corporate hierarchies, social hierarchies. The difference is, our hierarchies are based on competence, not size." She gestured casually at the assembled representatives. "For instance, the Jelkari over there have developed some genuinely impressive mathematical models for resource optimization. The Nethmore have figured out how to exist in multiple probability states, which has to be useful for risk assessment. The Veltai have managed to create a bureaucratic system so complex it's practically a form of art." Her gaze settled on Director Kral'thox. "But you? Your contribution seems to be sitting at the head of the table and expecting everyone to be impressed by your size. Where I come from, we call that middle management." The silence that followed was so complete that it achieved its own ecosystem. Species that had been engaged in whispered conversations suddenly found themselves intensely interested in their documentation, their environmental readings, or the fascinating patterns of quantum uncertainty visible in the room's translation matrices. Director Kral'thox rose from his position, his full 4 meters of armored height casting a shadow across half the table. In Drakari culture, this was the final warning before commercial dominance was established through what their business analysts euphemistically termed aggressive restructuring of negotiation parameters. Other species had learned to recognize this posture and respond accordingly, which typically involved immediate concession, rapid evacuation, or in extreme cases, updating their corporate succession plans. Vera looked up at him with mild interest, like someone watching a mildly entertaining presentation on quarterly earnings reports. "You will show proper respect," Kral'thox declared, or you will learn why the Hegemony Trade Consortium controls 43% of galactic commerce. Actually, Vera said, still seated and apparently unbothered by the 4 meters of predatory businessman looming over her, I'm pretty sure your consortium controls 43% of galactic commerce because you've been intimidating species that evolved on worlds where the most dangerous business practice was double entry. Bookkeeping. She took another sip of her coffee. But hey, I could be wrong. Maybe you really are as competent as you think you are. What happened next would be studied by business schools, military academies, and xenobiological research institutes for generations. It would become required viewing at every diplomatic training program in human space, and a cautionary tale told to young executives who thought that physical presence was more important than actual competence. Director Kral'thox, driven by 4,000 years of evolutionary programming and cultural conditioning that told him smaller beings were automatically subordinate to larger ones, reached down and grabbed Captain Vera Blackwood by the throat. In Drakhari business culture, this was a dominance display, a way of establishing commercial hierarchy without actually terminating the negotiation permanently. Among his own species, the gesture would result in immediate submission from the smaller individual, who would acknowledge the superior size of their better and adjust their business practices accordingly. It was, by Drakhari standards, remarkably civilized. What Director Kral'thox had failed to consider was that humans had not evolved in a civilized business environment. Vera looked down at the massive clawed hand wrapped around her neck, with the expression of someone who had just noticed a minor discrepancy in a quarterly report. Around the table, the remaining spectators held their breath, waiting for the inevitable human collapse, the desperate gasping for air, the acknowledgement of Drakhari commercial superiority. Instead, Vera looked back up at Director Kral'thox with genuine professional interest. "Okay," she said, her voice completely unaffected by the grip on her throat. "So this is the part where I'm supposed to be intimidated into accepting unfavorable contract terms, right?" The question caused Director Kral'thox's compound eyes to widen in confusion. The human should be gasping, struggling, showing some sign that his superior size was having the desired commercial effect. Instead, she seemed to be treating the situation like an interesting case study in comparative business practices. "I mean, I get the theory," Vera continued conversationally. "You're bigger than me, so you grab my neck to demonstrate physical dominance and establish negotiating superiority. It's very straightforward, very logical. The thing is, you seem to be operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about human physiology, psychology, and business ethics." She shifted slightly in her chair, not struggling against his grip, but simply adjusting her position for comfort. "First, humans are really, really hard to intimidate through physical contact. We've got redundant circulatory systems, backup respiratory pathways, and enough adrenaline production capacity to power a small manufacturing facility. Evolution, you know? When your planet tries to kill you every day, you develop contingencies." Director Kral'thox tightened his grip, applying pressure that would have crushed the windpipe of most galactic species and caused immediate submission from the rest. Vera's expression didn't change. "Second," she continued, "we don't really do the physical dominance thing the way most species do. Sure, we have organizational hierarchies and power structures, but they're based on competence, results, and value creation. The biggest human isn't automatically the CEO. Sometimes it's the smartest, sometimes it's the most experienced, sometimes it's just whoever happens to be best at the specific job that needs doing." Around the table, the remaining spectators watched in horrified fascination as the human delivered what amounted to a business management lecture while being strangled by a 4-meter alien executive. "And third," Vera said, her tone becoming slightly less conversational and slightly more educational, "you're making a really fundamental error in assuming that smaller means weaker or that physical intimidation is an acceptable negotiation tactic. See, humans didn't evolve to be the biggest predators in our environment. We evolved to be the smartest, the most adaptable, and when necessary, the most efficient problem solvers." She reached up casually and placed her hands on Director Kral'thox's wrist, not struggling against his grip, just resting her fingers on his exoskeleton, like she was checking his pulse or evaluating the structural integrity of his armor. "So here's what's going to happen," she continued, and now her voice carried a tone that made every survival instinct of every remaining being in the room start screaming warnings. "I'm going to give you exactly 5 seconds to let go of my neck and apologize for this remarkably unprofessional display of attempted intimidation. If you don't, I'm going to demonstrate why humans are classified as Category 9 Deathworlders, and you're going to discover that sometimes the most dangerous predator in the room is the one that doesn't look dangerous at all." Director Kral'thox, caught between his cultural programming and a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong with his understanding of the situation, made the mistake that would define the rest of his very short future. He tightened his grip further. 5, Vera said calmly. The pressure on her throat was now sufficient to crush reinforced titanium. Her voice remained steady. 4. Director Kral'thox's other 5 arms tensed, preparing to deliver additional dominance displays, if this one proved insufficient. Around the table, the last few spectators began backing away, their various forms of threat detection screaming warnings about imminent commercial restructuring. 3. The human's hands were still resting gently on his wrist, apparently doing nothing more threatening than conducting a casual structural analysis. But somehow, the gesture was beginning to feel less casual and more like an engineer identifying exactly where to place the explosive charges. 2. Director Kral'thox looked down into Vera's eyes and saw something that made his evolutionary hindbrain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive through millions of years of natural selection, suddenly realize that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The eyes looking back at him weren't the eyes of prey. They were the eyes of something that had evolved to solve problems by removing them from existence. 1. What happened next lasted approximately 0.8 seconds and involved a demonstration of leverage, joint manipulation, and applied engineering principles that would later be required study material at 17 different military academies. Vera's hands, which had been resting so casually on Director Kral'thox's wrist, suddenly moved with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive training in both mechanical systems and their systematic failure modes. Her left hand found the exact pressure point where his exoskeleton joined at the primary wrist articulation, while her right hand gripped his forearm and applied rotational force in a direction that Drakari anatomy was simply not designed to handle. The movement was economical, efficient, and utterly devastating, the kind of solution that a human engineer might apply to a particularly stubborn mechanical problem. The crack of his wrist breaking was audible throughout the conference chamber. Director Kral'thox's grip on her throat disappeared as pain receptors he didn't even know he possessed suddenly began broadcasting emergency signals. He tried to step backward, tried to use his other arms to re-establish dominance, tried to process what had just happened to his supposedly superior anatomy. Vera stood up smoothly, still holding his broken wrist, and used his own momentum against him as he tried to pull away. The movement was a perfect demonstration of physics applied to problem solving. She pivoted slightly, redirected his weight, and applied pressure in exactly the right place to send all 4 meters of armored executive crashing to the floor with enough force to crack the reinforced decking. Before Director Kral'thox could process what had happened, before he could call for security or engage any of his species' emergency protocols, Vera was kneeling beside him, with one knee pressed against his throat and her hands positioned on either side of his head with the kind of precision that suggested extensive familiarity with structural failure points. "You know," she said conversationally, as if she were commenting on quarterly projections rather than restraining a creature that could have torn most beings into component parts, "the thing about being from a Deathworld is that you learn to solve problems quickly and efficiently. When everything on your planet wants to kill you, you don't have the luxury of extended negotiations. You identify the threat, neutralize it, and get back to work." Director Kral'thox tried to speak, tried to move, tried to bring his superior size and strength to bear against this impossible situation. But his broken wrist was sending waves of agony through his nervous system, and the human's positioning was perfect. Any movement he made would only give her more leverage to work with. The reports probably mentioned that humans are persistence hunters. Vera continued, adjusting her grip slightly. What they might not have explained is what that really means in a business context. It means we evolve to pursue objectives until we achieve them. It means we're designed to keep working long after other species would have given up. And it means that when we decide a problem needs to be solved, we don't stop until it's solved. Her hands shifted position, and suddenly Director Kral'thox could feel the exact points where she could apply pressure to snap his neck with the same casual efficiency she'd used to break his wrist. "So here's your choice," she said. "You can apologize for your remarkably unprofessional attempt at intimidation, acknowledge that physical coercion is not an acceptable business practice, and spend the rest of this meeting learning about modern commercial practices like a civilized executive." Or, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The alternative was clear in the positioning of her hands, the steadiness of her voice, and the complete lack of emotion in her eyes, as she calculated exactly how much force would be required to solve this particular structural problem permanently. "I apologize," Director Kral'thox managed to gasp out. I did not understand." "No," Vera agreed, "you didn't. But that's okay. Ignorance is fixable, assuming you survive long enough to learn from it." She released him and stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her business suit. Director Kral'thox remained on the floor, cradling his broken wrist and trying to process what had just happened to his understanding of commercial hierarchy. "Now then," Vera said, turning to address the remaining spectators with the same cheerful professionalism she'd used at the beginning of the meeting. "Where were we? I think someone was about to review the proposed contract modifications." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Director Kral'thox's labored breathing and the quiet hum of the station's life support systems. Then, slowly, the Galactic delegation began to emit a prismatic light pattern that the universal translator interpreted as nervous laughter mixed with profound respect. "Perhaps," their lead mathematician said, his crystalline form flickering with what might have been amusement or terror, "we should discuss the human proposals in more detail." 4 hours later, as the trade conference finally concluded and the various species began making their excuses to leave, Captain Vera Blackwood found herself alone with the Galactic delegation in the conference chamber. The binary stars visible through the chamber's viewport cast their light through the transparent aluminum, creating patterns that shifted and changed like a kaleidoscope made of cosmic fire. "That was educational," the lead mathematician admitted, his light patterns conveying something that approximated impressed bewilderment. Vera shrugged. "I tried to warn him. Humans are generally pretty clear about our business practices. We'll put up with a lot of things: cultural differences, bureaucratic inefficiencies, even weird ceremonial requirements. But we draw the line at physical intimidation during contract negotiations." The reports, another Galactic said carefully, suggested that humans were dangerous. "We had not fully understood what that meant in a commercial context." "Oh, we're very dangerous," Vera agreed cheerfully. "We're adaptable, persistent, creative problem solvers who approach challenges with a combination of analytical thinking and controlled application of force. But here's the thing: we're only dangerous to things that threaten us or interfere with our business objectives." She looked out at the stars, her expression thoughtful. Director Kral'thox made the classic mistake of assuming that might makes right, that bigger automatically means more profitable, that physical intimidation is an acceptable negotiation strategy. "Where I come from, we have a saying: the customer is always right, but the supplier doesn't have to be intimidated." We do not understand this metaphor. It means that successful business relationships are based on mutual benefit and professional respect, not fear and dominance. A smaller company with better products and services can outcompete something 10 times its size if it knows how to innovate and when to compete aggressively. The Galactic's light patterns shifted to something that might have been understanding. "And humans are very good at competitive innovation. We've had to be," Vera said. "Our planet didn't give us much choice. Everything wanted to eat us, poison us, or crush us, so we learned to compete back. We learned to use tools, to work together, to think our way around problems that should have killed us. And when thinking wasn't enough, we learned to be very, very good at solving problems permanently. She turned to face them, and her smile was as bright and terrifying as it had been when she first arrived. But here's what the reports probably didn't mention: we're also really good at business partnerships. Once you establish that you're not a threat, that you're not trying to dominate or control the relationship, humans can be incredibly reliable partners. We'll work for our business associates just as hard as we'll work against our competitors. And which are we? The lead mathematician asked. Vera's smile became genuine, warm, and completely unterrifying. That depends entirely on you. The next morning, the Galactic Trade Commission received a report that would reshape interstellar commerce for the next century. It was filed under Commercial Incident Reports and marked with 23 different regulatory warnings. But the summary was surprisingly straightforward. Human business practices remain highly effective. Recommend avoiding physical contact during negotiations without explicit consent. Also recommend treating humans as preferred partners rather than subordinate vendors. Also recommend updating commercial insurance policies for all trade conferences involving human representatives. Also recommend never, under any circumstances, grabbing a human by the throat during contract negotiations. The report was signed by the Jelkari Collective and countersigned by Captain Vera Blackwood, who had apparently spent the morning helping Director Kral'thox file his medical insurance claims and teaching him some basic human business phrases, including please, thank you, and let's discuss this professionally. 6 months later, the Hegemony Trade Consortium would become one of humanity's most reliable commercial partners. Having discovered that human engineering solutions and streamlined business processes were exactly what they needed to improve their profit margins by 43%. Director Kral'thox himself would go on to become something of an expert on human business practices, writing several well-regarded papers on the topic of effective interspecies commerce and why physical intimidation is bad for quarterly earnings. But that night, as the various species returned to their corporate quarters and the station settled into its quiet cycle, one thing was abundantly clear to everyone who had witnessed the day's events. The galaxy had just gotten a lot more efficient, a lot more competitive, and humans were going to revolutionize interstellar commerce, whether anyone was ready for it or not. After all, they had already proven they were excellent at making business partners and absolutely terrifying at dealing with aggressive competitors. In a galaxy full of both, those were exactly the skills the market had been waiting for.